Hey guys, and welcome to Conspiracy and Cocktails. I'm Dell, and I am drinking a London Pride beer, and I am here with my co host Jenny. What are you sipping on?
I have a lemonade and gin.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. Let's get into today's case Hamlet, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and The Merchant of Venice. These are just some of the works credited to William Shakespeare. Jenny, what is your favorite work of Shakespeare?
I really like Macbeth. My English teacher had us do a lot of acting out of the different scenes. We even reenacted the banquet scene as a class with snacks and props and everything. So that always, makes me smile thinking about it. What about you?
My favorite is Hamlet, with The Merchant of Venice coming in a close second. I really think that the story of Hamlet is relatable and showcases the wolves of following a path of revenge. People tend to have this fantasy related to gaining the perfect revenge for a perceived wrongdoing to them. This fantasy is far from the truth, and following a path of revenge usually leads to the seeker destroying themselves, like in the case of Hamlet. While Shakespeare is probably one of the most well known authors in history, and his work is frequently required for school, there are some doubts as to whether Shakespeare actually was the writer. The first person to raise doubts was James Whitmore in 1785. Wilmot proposed his argument, which became known as the anti Stratfordian theory, based on the homeland of the author, which staunchly stated that Shakespeare didn't write his legendary plays. Most people that believe this theory suggest that Shakespeare canon exhibits broad learning, knowledge of foreign languages and geography, and a familiarness with royal court and politics. Therefore, no one but a highly educated individual or court insider could have written about them. Wilmot was so determined to run Shakespeare's name through the mud, he cut corners in his research, and his positions were later found to be easily debunked. And while he never stated who he thought the real author was, others have proposed several names. The Baconian theory of Shakespeare authorship holds that Sir Francis Bacon, the philosopher, essayist, and scientist, wrote the plays that were publicly attributed to William Shakespeare. Bacon was proposed as the sole author by William Henry Smith in 1856 and as a co-author by Delia Bacon in 1857. Smith compared passages such as Bacon's, quote, poetry is nothing else but feigned history, end quote, with Shakespeare's, quote, the truest poetry is most feigning, end quote. They also compare Bacon's quote of, he wished him not to shut the gates of your majesty's mercy, end quote, with Shakespeare's quote, the gates of mercy shall be all shut up, end quote. In a letter addressed to John Davies, Bacon closes it with, quote, so desiring you to be good to concealed poets, end quote. And people who support the Baconian theory state that this was self referential. The next theory is the Oxfordian theory of Shakespeare authorship, which contends that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote the plays and poems traditionally attributed to William Shakespeare. And since the 1920s, this theory has been the most popular. For mainstream Shakespearean scholars, the most compelling evidence against the Oxford theory, besides the historical evidence for William Shakespeare, is his death in 1604, since 12 of the plays have been accepted to be written after that date. The supporters of this theory question that if Shakespeare lived until 1616, why did he not eulogize Queen Elizabeth at her death in 1603 or Henry, Prince of Wales, at his in 1612. They believe Oxford's 1604 death provides the explanation. And in an age where such actions were expected, Shakespeare also failed to memorialize the coronation of James I in 1604, the marriage of Princess Elizabeth in 1612, and the investiture of Prince Charles as the new Prince of Wales in 1613. Shakespeare refers to the latest scientific discoveries and events through the end of the 16th century, but is mute about science at Oxford's death in 1604. So these are just two of the theories, and they're the most widely accepted. There is one more I wanted to mention, but before I get into that, Jenny, what are your thoughts on the Baconian and the Oxford theory of Shakespeare authorship?
I don't know. I think that I do just believe that Shakespeare was who he was and, he was a very talented writer.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that Shakespeare was a brilliant writer. And the fact that a lot of this is tied to where he grew up and this one person not believing that someone that grew up there could actually write such amazing works really speaks to that. And the final theory that I want to get into is maybe the craziest one. The Marlowean theory of Shakespeare authorships hold that the poet and playwright Christopher Marlowe was the main author of the poems and plays attributed to William Shakespeare. And this theory goes even further because it claims that he didn't actually die on May 30th, 1573, as the historical record states, and that he faked his death. A central plank in the theory is that the first clear association of William Shakespeare with the works bearing his name was just 13 days after Marlowe's supposed death. Shakespeare's first published work, Venus and Adonis, was registered on April 18th, 1573, and it didn't have his name. It did bear his name when it went for sale a couple months later. This argument remains highly contentious, and no mainstream scholar of Shakespeare's life and work currently accepts it. Stanley Wells summarizes the reasons why Shakespearean scholars in general utterly reject any idea of plagiarism. He said, quote, all of this compounds the initial ludicrousy of the idea. During this period, he is alleged to have produced a string of masterpieces which must be added to those he had already written, which no one in the busy and gossipy world of theater knew to be his, and for which he was willing to allow his Stratford contemporary to receive all the credit and reap all the rewards. End quote. And I think that strikes at the heart of a lot of this, that if you were really the ghost writer, why wouldn't you want credit? I can see how if you were unsure of the reception the work was going to get, you would have the first couple works be under this pseudonym. But once you saw it get really popular, I would think that most people would want credit for the work that they were doing. What do you think?
Yeah, I would think so too. Back then, everything was just like such a rigid system, and you would think if anything would, help you achieve higher status in that system, you would want to take part in it and maybe not flaunt it, but be very proud of where you came from and how you rose.
And just to have more evidence to debunk the theories, many are tied again to the belief that a lowbrow couldn't write such highly celebrated work. But Shakespeare grew up in a family of some importance in Stratford. His father, John Shakespeare, was one of the wealthiest men in Stratford. He was an alderman and later high bailiff of the corporation. It would be surprising if William Shakespeare hadn't attended a local grammar school, as such institutions were founded to educate boys of Shakespeare's moderately well to do standing. So he's not even as lowbrow as these people are claiming that he was. And just to add to that, just because you were not born into a high status or a high level of privilege does not mean that you cannot produce great works that would be enjoyed by people of all walks of life. So that's where we'll leave you. There are still people who are debating whether William Shakespeare of Stratford actually wrote the great, amazing works that we all know and love. I'm going to err on the side of there was this one guy named William Shakespeare who knew how to write a play.